I'll introduce our next guest. The first speaker this morning is Professor Konarzewski, who is a professor of biology at the University of Białystok. Professor Konarzewski is one of the best known biologists in Poland and has a particular interest in evolutionary ecology. He, I believe, spent a few years also working with Jared Diamond, the American biologist. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, indeed.
Right. So, Professor, what will you be talking to us about today?
Okay, thank you for this really kind introduction. First and foremost, thank you for the invitation. I am a little bit out of let's say, this circle, because I am an evolutionary biologist rather than a psychologist, philosopher, and so on. But still, I believe we all have something in common. There is an interest in several really important topics that cover more than just a specific field, and definitely consciousness is one of them. That's the question of consciousness puzzles people since at least 4, maybe 500 years ago. So that's why I picked up this topic for this morning. Let me share the screen, and I hope that I can start with the presentation. Can you see the screen? First and foremost, let me.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Now the question is whether you can see my pointer as well. Can you see?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. So let me go to full screen. There we go. And let me just say a few words of introduction. The Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness, that's the document that has been published with a great splash in 2012. And at that time, it caught my attention, not only because this was a bold step towards, let's say, the proclamation of an interesting and very important things about biology, but not only, from people that have a lot to say those days in science, and not only, including Stephen Hawking, who was as you know, a physicist rather than a biologist or psychologist, but nevertheless, he and many other science celebrities, so to speak, endorsed this document, which by itself was a kind of an interesting story. But I was first and foremost puzzled by let's say, the evolutionary perspective of the Cambridge Declaration and the consciousness as the phenomenon. Can we somehow explain it in evolutionary terms, in an evolutionary perspective? As for myself, I strongly adhere to the view that nothing in biology, but not only, is relevant unless it's explained in terms of theory of the Darwinian theory. So the big question that I want to pose today is whether the Cambridge Declaration relates somehow to evolutionary perspective, and whether consciousness by itself is a problem that can be tackled from the evolutionary perspective. But let me get back for a moment to the significance of the problem. And let me remind you that in 2005, AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, published a special edition of Science where the editors assembled 125 so-called big questions. And one of those questions, this was the next one to the question about the universe, what was the universe made of, was the question about the origin and the biological underpinnings of consciousness. So this is indeed something that Oops, I'm sorry. I have to get back to this mode. So this was indeed something that that caught my eye in 2005, and this question was with me for the years to come. And I believe that this question is something that by itself warrants a number of minutes of discussion and presentation. What was inside? That's a piece written by Greg Miller on the biological basis of consciousness. And of course, I'm not going to read this here, but let me draw your attention to the very last paragraph, which I think is much telling. I'm not sure whether the print is clear, so I'll read it. Until very recently, tackling the subject of the consciousness was a dubious career move for any scientist without tenure, and perhaps a Nobel Prize already in the bag. Fortunately, more young researchers are now joining the fray. The unanswered question should keep them and the printing press busy for many years to come. Well, as for today, I still haven't bagged the Nobel Prize, but I do have a tenure, so I feel confident and safe to discuss the matter. And I also think that the young researchers that would be interested in the subject are indeed nowadays should be more encouraged than before to try to tackle the question. And the question is not easy, as I will explain, and it's still very controversial, though many years have passed since this Cambridge Declaration has been presented. So what is the, let's say, the setting stage of the whole problem? I believe that to really reflect on this, we need to just stop over and say a few words about a tremendous paradigm shift that we faced, particularly in the 20th century. And if you compare the ancient scala naturae that was prevalent in understanding of the nature as such, for, well, much of the history, we humans were at the top. We were the pinnacle of the creation. Everything was, let's say, less complex, less advanced. And this was, of course, this notion of increasing complexity and ascending of all virtues that culminated in human being. And this was the way that people understood the nature as such. And today we know and pretty much agree that humans are just one of the very many solutions brought by evolutionary processes in nature. And from the perspective of evolutionary progress, so to speak, there is none of them is kind of really special, because we should consider this achievement, so to speak, in terms of Darwinian fitness. And if we think about it, then of course humans are quite successful as a species. We strive on Earth for at least 200,000 years, or maybe a little bit longer, as a well-defined species, biological species. But there are many, many more species that are long-lasted and originated not 100,000 years, but many million years ago. So in this perspective, we are not very specific, and the solutions that came with us, I mean, the biological solutions, are not very, very successful in the time scale, as well as I said, the Darwinian fitness understood as let's say the efficacy of spread of certain traits that we consider adaptive. Among them, maybe consciousness is this pre-eminent trait that we should consider as something that sets stage for humanity, but not only. And this is the thing that has been highlighted recently, but let me once again just reflect on one very influential thinker, and I mean René Descartes, who at some point, even though he's still considered the father of quite modern thinking about psychology, he noticed that there is nothing that which leads feeble minds more readily astray from the straight path of virtue than to imagine that the soul of animals is of the same nature as our own. So this was the starting point. And again, this paradigm shift that I have just briefly highlighted shows how much we departed from this point of view who really separates in a great way humans from other animals. And this is practically the main message of the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness, because there is no more divide. And the Cambridge Declaration in a nutshell is something telling us that we are not that much different with respect to consciousness from the other beings, at least from those that we can include in our scientific undertaking and study in a way that gives us the background for this kind of inference. Let me remind you again that this Cambridge Declaration has been officially publicized during the Francis Crick Memorial Conference in Cambridge, UK. And there were many really important and eminent scientists in attendance. I have already mentioned Stephen Hawking, Irene Pepperberg, and many others that were very well known in this area. So this was a kind of declaration that was not only forceful in terms of the stature of people who backed this document, but also the stage. There were the whole event was well publicized, and the major broadcaster all over the world highlighted it. So this was a kind of a very forceful message to not only scientific circles, but the public at large, that here we declare that we have no longer considered this great divide that I have just mentioned, referring to the words of Descartes, that they are valid. They are invalid, and in fact, we should change the attitude towards the other animals and consider them, if not equal to us in terms of consciousness, then at least admit that to some extent this consciousness is not only a unique human trait. Okay, what about the content? I'm not going to read the whole document. It would be really way too far. I just want to bring your attention to the first few sentences of the document, and let me highlight a few things that seems to me quite striking in the way that the whole document has been cast. And one of the things that is clear from the start is that the document misses something that should be normally regarded the main point and the starting point. That is the kind of let's say more or less, but still fairly strict documentation what actually the consciousness is. So there is nothing like a very straightforward sentence saying what they mean by consciousness. There are some more vague phrases like experiences, affective states, or substrates of consciousness states, and things of that nature. But there is no strict definition of consciousness in this document. And when I read it for the first time, this was kind of very bizarre to me that some people drafted the declaration about a very important phenomenon, and then they don't define this phenomenon in the first place. Why was it so? Well, of course, this was not an omission. This was definitely something that was clear. This omission was clear to the authors, but they simply elected not to define the subject, because this was even to them a rather vague term. So they elected to add a number of other conditions and descriptive sentences, narrowing down the meaning of the consciousness, but still, quite frankly, and I invite you to read this document again, I must say that having read this just before our meeting, just for preparation, I was still left with a feeling that definitely I'm not sure what kind of phenomenon they are talking about. So I'll try to fill this gap a little bit for you, and not let's say define. I don't feel competent to define the consciousness for myself in terms of let's say my limited knowledge, but I'll of course refer to a number of researchers that tried to do that in the meantime, and there are of course a number of attempts, and some of them I think are quite successful. So let me start by saying that indeed this question of course has been tackled quite some time ago, and let me just remind you about one of the people that really contributed to this issue and is largely forgotten. I think this is very unlawful, because his contribution is really tremendous, and I mean George Romanes, who was the contemporary to Charles Darwin. They knew each other quite well, and Romanes was very much under influence of Darwinian thinking at the time. He wrote a book, Animal Intelligence, Mental Evolution in Animals and Mental Evolution in Man. And this is really an interesting and still quite modern book. And there are a number of things, a number of statements there that I think we can still agree upon. And there is one thing that I would specifically like to highlight, because just following Romanes, he highlighted that any kind of thinking, he didn't write about the consciousness per se, but still he recognized that one of the preconditions for consideration of consciousness must be the ability of any organism to learn. And by learning, and this is the red, the sentence highlighted in red at the top of the slide. Let me just read this loudly. Does the organism learn to make the new adjustments or to modify old ones in accordance with the results of its own individual experience? So the key words here are as follows. This is this individual experience, so must be memory of course involved, and learning, okay? And of course the self-reference point, which is in this case this ability to separate self from the rest of the world. And this ability to separate self from the rest of the world, even if not spelled out by Romanes, is clear that this, let's say, the bottom line of his reasoning. So in fact, he was writing about the consciousness, even though he did not specify this in a way that we probably would do it today. So this influential thinker was obviously one whose legacy is still with us. And with that, I'll allude later on to a wonderful book published by wrote by Ginsburg and Jabłonka in 2018, and definitely those two authors were under a strong influence of Romanes' thinking, and that's exactly where I think we should, from the start, try to think about consciousness in a little bit broader term. I mean, this is not only the capacity to separate self from the rest of the world, but this is also the functional phenomenon with the ability to learn as the prime mechanism, making this separation of the self from the rest of the world possible. And that's, I think, this is one of the major themes that will be with us to the rest of my talk. Can we try to be more specific about the consciousness and try to find some good ways of specifying what this is all about? One of the examples of I think a pretty successful attempt to say and to define the consciousness is the one that I found in a fairly influential paper by Baron and Klein about the insects. By the way, I'll get back to this paper later on. And I believe that this is in the introductory part of this paper, I found one sentence that is also really important to narrowing down what we should understand by the term. And this is this sentence in red: just integrating information is not sufficient for subjective experience, no matter how complex or well integrated the information. I think that this is the crux of the matter. This is not enough to integrate the information from the outside world and convert it somehow. We must have yet a kind of emergent property that makes the entity capable of integrating information a conscious one. And this emergent property is something that still eludes us. And let me say it right now. This is one of the reasons why we still don't have a good grasp on the matter of consciousness, because this is emergent property that goes up from this physical matter that consists or forms the brain and so on. So this is something that is well known as the, let's say, the brain body divide, and this is something that is still kind of eluding those that are trying to understand the consciousness. But nevertheless, I think that this remark by Baron and Klein again narrows down what we should consider as consciousness. All right, there are many other authors that tried to specify what we should mean by consciousness. One of them is Simona Ginsburg and Ewa Jabłonka, the two authors that wrote a beautiful book, The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul, and I highly recommend you this read. That's a long treatise where both authors start their journey with the consciousness from the Aristotelian times and gave us a really wonderful broad perspective on it. But I'm not going to come back to Aristotle thinking about it. It's for the sake of time, I don't think it's here so useful. But let me just highlight a few important points that were picked up by Ginsburg and Jabłonka and made as a kind of the information that is sufficient to consider any entity to be conscious. So any organism equipped with this 7 capabilities listed by Jabłonka should be considered conscious. I'm not going to go into the details, but let's see at least briefly what they were thinking about. The global activity and accessibility. Indeed, unless the entity, the organism is capable of making information available to other processes, cognitive processes, it probably cannot be considered conscious. binding and unification. So this is this creation of a single integrated experience from the multitude of information, incoming information. Indeed, that must be something that must be present to be conscious. The plasticity and learning, that's the echo of the Romanes thinking, I believe here. Intentionality. Well, of course, this is intentionality in terms of, let's say, the goal, an immediate goal of action, rather than intentionality that is running counter of, let's say, the long discussion about the intentionality of evolutionary processes. So indeed, it means that the organism is simply intentional in its short-term action. Of course, there must be the persistence of experience through time. So this is not just a simple reflex that appears and is gone to make things conscious. And values, emotions, and goals. That's really important and least possible to study, at least not on non-human subjects. And again, this is something that we should consider later on. And again, I think this is the most important part. This is embodiment, agency as a notion of self. So this capability of distinguishing self from the rest of the world. And of course, this is kind of the prerequisite of being conscious. That's not the only way the specificity of the term consciousness can be tackled. Let me bring you briefly, very briefly, another conditions that must be fulfilled, according to other researchers, to call a non-human animals conscious. And one of them, indeed, accessible in the recent years, is the condition of a specific patterns of EEG activity that must be present. And indeed, there is a list of extended list of organisms where there seems that wakefulness and REM sleep phase are present. So that's something that gives the hint that probably those organisms, even fish, are capable of the feat that we call consciousness to some extent. And then, of course, there are a number of, let's say, the anatomic conditions and structures that must be present according to our current knowledge to make things related to consciousness possible. Things like thalamocortical activity present, the brain activation during processing of sensorial stimuli, synchronization of the cortical and brainstem levels. That's really important, and I'll get back to this later on. And last but not least, the presence of egocentric maps for localizing individual in a given space. Indeed, even if an organism is capable of identifying itself in a space, then of course it means that the organism is kind of the center point of such a localizing map. So it does not make sense to localize an organism within its central processing unit, let's call it the brain, unless this is to some extent self-aware. And by the way, the presence of such a map has been recognized quite recently. In 2014, let me remind you, there was the Nobel Prize in medicine for discovering this kind of egocentric map. So this is indeed something that comes to a very coherent story with regard to, let's say, the way we understand the consciousness in terms of physiological activities and anatomical background of those activities. Can we then kind of map the design of the study on consciousness and what kind of components this studies should involve to be successful and finally to understand what the consciousness is all about? There seems that there are three ways to tackle the problem, and one of them, I have just mentioned this is the search for neurophysiological correlates, mostly with the use of comparative method. Comparative method has a long tradition in biology, and indeed has been very successful in many other ways. So perhaps we can use this comparative method to pinpoint those neurophysiological correlates that underlines the consciousness. Of course, this is not enough to identify such correlates, because we need to attribute the causal analysis to those correlations. Of course, correlations does not mean causation again. So this is a very weak argumentation unless we can really find the functional link between the components that create such correlations, and we can demonstrate that this is more than just a correlation, and this is a kind of a causation in terms of anatomical and physiological mechanisms involved. Here, at least three types of neural activity should be considered. And here I am alluding to a really interesting piece by Maldonado and colleagues from the Info Communications Journal. Indeed, I found it quite useful for today's presentation. So those three types of natural activity should be associated with the conscious mental representations, and we should find some ways of identifying those representations. They should be associated with sensory stimuli, and of course must be also present in terms of the respective behaviors. Some of those, like associated conscious mental representations, are rather difficult to study in non-human subjects, but still, at least as a kind of the research agenda, indeed it can be presented here. And then the identification of causal links must be reproducible, okay, and of course must be confirmed in a strictly rigorous way from the methodological standpoint, which is still I would say a weak point in many of those studies, because very many of them are simply anecdotal. Again, I'm not going to present you a long list of those anecdotes, but definitely this must be, to make a strong case, we need to be less anecdotal and more, let's say, coherent in finding confirmatory explanations of the hypothesis related to consciousness. Okay, let me spend a few minutes on the book by Ginsburg and Jabłonka, because as I said, I found it really interesting. And what they presented there is a kind of, let's say, research program related to the notion of what they call the unlimited associative learning as the prerequisite of consciousness. So this UAL refers to animals' ability to ascribe motivational value to a compound stimulus or action pattern, and to use it as the basis for future learning. So again, Ginsburg and Jabłonka associate consciousness with this motivations, but also with the stimulus that are linked with the learning of the present and using this knowledge for the future. So that's in a straight way a derivative from the earlier thinkers, that's for sure. And this is something that perhaps can really guide us in trying to narrow down, let's say, the research program on consciousness. But of course, it also has some limitations, and the authors are quite well aware of it. One of those limitations is the need to contrast this URL paradigm with the limited associative learning, as they call it, which is a simple reflection of the Skinnerian scenarios of let's say, explanation of the behavioral patterns observed in animals. And of course, they are very far from kind of Skinnerian thinking that is to them dead end in trying to explain, let's say, the consciousness in a functional terms. Okay, so what is, in a nutshell, the suggested way of studying the phenomenon consciousness? Well, let's see where this UAL is present, in which organism we can find the suite of traits that make them open-ended learning possible and enables them to ascribe motivational value. And then let's try to use the reverse engineering from the presence of UAL in those entities and try to find the physical underpinnings of this kind of traits present, and we can do it with our ability to a knowledge of thorough studies of the nervous system, central nervous system in different organisms. So in a sense, this is still a kind of very straightforward thinking that let's try to define the suite of traits that represent the consciousness, then identify those that fit the bill, and then let's see whether they share some common traits in their brain or central nervous system, and let's pinpoint those common traits, and then we will see which one of them are capable of UAL, and then we can find, let's say, a suite of organisms. We can define a suite of organisms that are capable of being conscious. So that's, let's say, the way of analyzing this subject as suggested by Ginsburg and Jabłonka. Well, this is something that is very again clear, and quite frankly, this to some extent is reminiscent of a very influential paper by Björn Merker, who in 2007 suggested that consciousness is possible without the cerebral cortex. So that in the nutshell, we don't need the neocortex to be conscious. And as such, this paper set the stage for the really bold studies on non-human subjects and non-human species that are probably conscious. So here comes with the Marker's paper yet another not definition on consciousness as such, but rather the functional definition of consciousness. And according to Merker, the primary function of consciousness is that of matching opportunities with the needs in a central notion stabilized body. And again, this seems, and he highlights this, that this can be done without neocortex, mammalian neocortex. So in a sense, that's something that really underpins the Cambridge Declaration, because if Merker is right, then of course we don't need a really sophisticated brain to be conscious, and it's enough to have this midbrain well developed, and we can suspect that pretty much any animal having the midbrain developed is conscious. So that's exactly what Merker suggested, and he, quite frankly, he didn't even consider the sophisticated brain as the need for being conscious. And midbrain, in his words, integrates spatial simulation and allows animals to interact with objects in a qualitatively different sets of ways, and that's enough to be really conscious. As you see from this graph, here we have the non-human brain, let's say, but this is still the brain with the midbrain structures that are present, of course, in humans, but not only in humans. Here is let's say the average brain of a mammal, and with those parts of the midbrain that are responsible for what is here to the left of the graph. This is state of self movement, and so on. All these things that I have already mentioned in previous slides that should build a foundation for being consciousness. So we don't need, indeed, according to Merker, but also the others that I have just referenced to be conscious. So that's let's say the reality space in this Björn-Merker's model. That's the graph that I borrowed from Ginsburg and Jabłonka. And indeed, we will have in a very specific areas of the midbrain, let's say the kind of reality space that that is considered by the ego center, that is in the midbrain rather than in a neocortex. So we don't need to have this modern part of the brain to really perceive the world in a way that separates self from the rest. Well, Ginsburg and Jabłonka moves on to try to identify those specific phylogenetic groups where these feats are possible. And as you see, this is a simple graph. Of course, mammals are capable of all of them: emotion, sensory, pleasure, play, and REM sleep. We know it well. But let's consider the upper part of this table, bony fish. Sensory pleasure, well, that we don't simply know. This is not that they are not capable, that the empty space rather notifies that there is not enough data. Salamanders, that's for sure, frogs. So pretty much all vertebrates, quite frankly, seems to be conscious according to this table. Let's confront this with another way of tackling the same problem, but in a slightly different categories. The primary self, the core self that's in the table, the self-consciousness and narrative self. I don't have time to really explain what these terms mean. I hope that the psychologists are with us. But anyway, at least for teleos fish, the primary cognitive consciousness, and this is from the paper by Fabre and others, means a primary representation of the world with objects and the proto-self. And that seems to be, at least with regard to the proto-self, present in all major phyla, vertebrate phyla. Have a look at the table: teleos, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and of course, Homo sapiens. So there seems that collectively, indeed, all these evidences that we have at hand at the moment they point to a widespread presence of consciousness in different phyla. How old would it be? Well, very many authors point to the early Cambrian period, that is more than 500 million years ago, when most of these major phylogenetic groups appeared. And if we accept this, then it means that the consciousness is as old as at least 500 million years. And what was the trigger for this incredible, excuse me, Cambrian explosion? There seems that this is mostly due to an increase of the oxygen level in the water at the time. See here on the graph at the bottom to the right of the right part hand side of the screen. The blue line is the level of oxygen as a percent of the contemporary level. So this was flat and close to zero for most of the time. And then in Cambrian time, it started to rise. And there seems that this oxygen level rise gave, let's say, the fuel to develop more complex brains. And this was the main reason. Brain is really has a very voracious appetite for oxygen. So we know it, and this is the physiologically, this is something that that all living creatures share. The neurons are simply very energy consuming. So without it, it would be impossible. So this was the, let's say, the ultimate factor that made it possible was the rise of the oxygen. Okay, and what was the, let's say, the first animal that we could possibly ascribe as conscious? There seems to be the lampreys. They appeared some 550 million years ago, as you see on the left. And the lampreys indeed have this functional homologs of all key nuclei involved in the vertebrate behavioral core control systems, all of those that has been listed as the prerequisites, anatomical requisites of being conscious. So indeed, as you probably see, we have the phylogenetic tree of pretty much all major phyla that should be, according to this reasoning, capable of being conscious to some extent. What about the insects? Well, if that's this kind of reasoning is, we can apply this to vertebrates, then there may be invertebrates that also have analogous structures in the brain can be conscious, and this was exactly the proposition put forward by Baron and Klein in the paper that I have already alluded to, where they claim that the control system of the insect brain is functionally analogous to the vertebrate brain. So maybe they are also, the insects are also conscious. Well, discussion, and I invite you to read this discussion, is quite much telling. One of the comments to this paper was by Key and colleagues, and I think the title speaks for itself. Insects cannot tell us anything about the subjective experience of consciousness. And let me just cite one sentence from this, and this is, I think, much telling. The problem is that the Baron and Klein's hypothesis speaks to the analogous evolution of the nervous system capable of integrating processes. It is silent on the emergence of subjective experience. And I have already highlighted it. It's not enough to show that there are some anatomical components that we ascribe to consciousness. This is still, it still requires a leap of faith to acknowledge the emergence of subjective experience from these anatomical structures. So let me just allude on this a little bit. This is the book that I like quite a lot, even though it was published in 1991, and this gives the whole suite of examples of comparative methods in evolutionary biology. And we have no problems in evolutionary biology studying things like the evolution of the limbs. Here you have a simple comparison of the wings. No worries. This is really legitimate way and nobody disputes this, but can we really apply the same thinking to the brain? Can we be really sure that just the analogy warrants us that our reasoning is absolutely 100% methodologically okay? Well, that's the doubt. That's the big doubt that we still cannot, let's say, address in an adequate way. So just to summarize this, do functional homologies of the brain structures involved in primary processes, process emotions warrant the existence of emerging properties of the consciousness? I believe this sentence and this question is still unanswered. how can we possibly bridge this insight from the first subjective and third person objective perspectives? Don't we mix apples and oranges here? Well, that's back the question, the answer, and I believe that this is something that we should still consider. So yes, this is this famous paper that is still, I think, in place and very appropriate to cite, what it's like to be a bat. And I'm afraid that we still don't know how this is all about, quite frankly. So we should finally also consider the possibility that the consciousness is simply a spandrel. So this is a co-product of other things. Well, I don't think this is true, but still, at least as the null hypothesis, I think we should consider this as a serious methodological problem and start from there. Otherwise, we are doomed to repeat, let's say, the whole pitfalls of naive adaptationism that we discussed in evolutionary biologists already in the 70s. So is there any way, or is there any program that can answer this in a more forceful way? Well, one of the ways that we can try is to reenact evolution. I was very surprised with the results of the study published in 2013 by the colleagues from Uppsala, Sweden, where they started to select the guppies, the small fish that you probably recognize because this is the pets in very many tanks present at home, and they selected them for the brain size. And it seemed that the response to selection was very simple and very straightforward and strong. Right after 3 or 4 generations, you see the difference in the brain size in a matter of 3 generations here. So the brain size can evolve very quickly. What about the capabilities of those of this fish to solve some problems? Here is the very simple graph showing the way that has been analyzed. So simply the male to the right was the male to the left was searching for the way to find a female to the right, and the brain was the prerequisite for searching and learning the way in a shortest time. And indeed, large brain fish were much better. So they were brainier, not only in terms of anatomy, but also they simply learn faster. And let me remind you that fast learning seems to be the prerequisite for being conscious. And that's just a few graphs from my own experience. This is the selection program that we held here in Białystok since 20 years ago, and this was unintentionally related to the issue that we discussed, because we selected mice for high or low basal metabolic rate. This is something that has directly bears a direct relevance to the oxygen uptake, and I have already explained it to you that the oxygen was, let's say, is the fuel for the central nervous system. And indeed, after a number of decades and generations, we got the mice that were, let's say, that had high basal metabolic rate or low. But for us, the most important is that those that have this high metabolic rates are also capable of fast learning, and they manifest the long-term potentiation of the neurons that is much higher than in the low metabolic rate line. And this is the prerequisite for learning. Again, this is directly related to the plasticity of the neurons and so on and so forth. So indeed, there seems that at least the intellectual traits that are related to consciousness, because I don't think we'll find a single trait that can be the proxy of the consciousness, but very many of them are very, as you see, easy to select for. So maybe we can design some kind of a study that simply reenact the evolution of consciousness and will help us to understand the mechanisms behind it in the non-human subjects. So with that, let me conclude that this change of paradigm that I have started, where in the tree of life, we're in the pinnacle, and one of this uniqueness of humans was the consciousness, our consciousness. We have been degraded to just one of the few branches of this more or less horizontal tree of life. And indeed, we share consciousness to some extent with other organisms, but the extent of this common ground of consciousness is still an open question. And let me invite the younger colleagues who hopefully listen to me to really try to tackle this question. This is a big question, one of those major questions of biology, as I have explained in the beginning. And with that, let me hope that there will be a new input from younger colleagues to understand this big puzzle of biology and not only. And with that, let me thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Konarzewski. Questions, please. Okay, there's a question in the chat from Michał Misiak. What is your view on whether there are any practical, political, or ethical implications for recognizing or not recognizing consciousness in some animals?
Well, of course, the most straightforward and immediate one is the animal welfare. Because if we admit that the other animals, particularly mammals, are conscious, then of course it's the whole suite of questions, moral questions follow. So that's of course something that is now under agenda. So this, I think, the major area of discussion that we should be aware and do something with it. The animal welfare, simply speaking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's also a question from, well, Petr Tureček wants to ask a question. Petr?
Hey, I just wanted to ask, what's your perspective on this? I basically think that the term consciousness is now quite equivalent to the term phlogiston in 17th century. I think basically it's like we can do very well in science, in anything, without this term, because we have, I think, quite good terms as memory, processing power, and these things can be under selection. And I think that we are living in this illusion of consciousness, which I think also quite motivates the Nagel's paper, what is it like to be a bat, and these things. And I think it makes sense as a medical term, as an opposition to unconscious, like the patient is unconscious or conscious. So it's like this, it's diagnosis or something like that, that makes sense, but I don't think it makes sense in evolutionary biology, because I think there is no such thing as consciousness. Yeah, that's my opinion.
Okay, well, this is, I would say, a rather radical point of view. Of course, just, you know, invoking the Occam razor, as long as you want to carry a rigorous evolutionary study, it's better indeed keep off the consciousness as a term, because we simply don't have the proxies of it well specified. But as I say, if you are after studies some excuse me, correlates, then of course it's legitimate. But be aware that there will be still a number of people that will be always tempted, and very rightfully tempted, to consider consciousness as the phenomenon of its own. I mean, cognitivists, psychologists, and so on. So we should address this from the standpoint of evolutionary biology, not just say, no, it doesn't make sense at all. I don't think this is a good stance.
I think my point is that we should try to change the vocabulary to allow us to construct like models with some predictive capacity. And I've never seen a functional model that would explicitly use this term instead of, I don't know, like a conglomerate of other terms that make sense from morphological even or anatomical perspective.
You are right, but probably, and please, that's my stance. I believe that we should admit that perhaps we have we are considering a phenomenon that is real but so complex that can't be tackled from a very reductionist perspective. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's the problem indeed. So if we admit that this is a real thing but so complicated and multidimensional that we can't do it in a way that we study, let's say, the evolution of the wing, as I explained. That's we are doomed to try to use the best possible approach rather than this that would be ultimately straightforward and much telling. That's all I can say on that.
Okay, thanks for the response.
Yes, if I can just say something here. While I was looking at the presentation, I was really thinking about the situation with the evolution of vision, right? Which of course has evolved a number of different times, and which in the different cases has physiological substrata which are quite different, right? So I mean, that for me was a big worry with thinking about what the substrata for consciousness is, especially since we have such an inability to be able to tell whether something actually is conscious as opposed to whether something has vision, right?
Yes. Now, vision is a simple problem.
Yes.
When we compare it to consciousness, but yes, that's correct. Let me reiterate. I think that the crux of the problem is this emergent property of very subjective feelings that we simply can't comprehend as a third person related to any non-human subject. And I'm not sure we can really bridge this divide. That's my major concern about, let's say, any research program related to study on consciousness in non-human subjects.
Yes. Oh, my personal area of study is religion, and it seems to me like there are these kinds of topics where it is very, very difficult to make progress on for a very long time, because simply the methods and the theories are lacking.
Yeah, I think that's the case here.
Yeah. All right, thank you very much. Other questions, please. Okay, I see no further questions, and we have gone a little bit over time. So perhaps I will thank you now, Professor Konarzewski.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And we will head over to the Gather Town, which is a virtual space where people can continue discussions informally. Of course, Professor, you are more than welcome to come and join us and see what that looks like. Ola, would you be able to throw the link into the chat?
As always.